Tilda, I recently found myself tumbling down a rabbit hole, and this one led me to some very interesting points, and really highlighted how people will misuse data, either intentionally or unintentionally, and all for the greater good of a little bit of slacktivist virtue signaling. So today, I am going to be taking on the role of the masked magician, and I am going to show you a little trick. I am going to show you how to make the overwhelming majority of victims of child abuse disappear, and how you can blame men for it. Do you want to see how it's done? Of course you do. Let's go. I was recently sent a link to this Facebook page, AJ+, specifically to this post. More than 90% of violence against children is caused by men. These guys are painting their nails to put an end to it, and this is part of the #PolishedMan campaign. Now, immediately, this 90% of violence against children is caused by men just sounded wrong. You'll see why I thought that sounded wrong a little bit later, but I decided to check the video out to see if this person has accurately portrayed what was actually in there. Unsurprisingly, they haven't. The actual claim from the campaign was as follows.
Over 90% of sexual violence perpetrated towards children is driven by men.
As you can see, that's a very different claim. 90% of sexual violence compared to 90% of violence. AJ Plus gets an immediate F for basic comprehension skills, made all the more shocking by the fact that they were the ones who edited that video together. So then I found myself with this 90% of sexual violence against children is caused by men figure. Now, sexual violence against children is not a figure that I've really ever heard bandied around too often, so I didn't actually know whether or not this statement was true. And of course, me being me, I thought, hey, I'm going to do a little bit of legwork and see if there's any validity to it. So I went on over to their website, polishedman.com, and found out that this was another project by YGAP. YGAP is an Australian organisation, and it helps local organisations in other countries come up with solutions to problems that they have. They seem to be largely focused around education, healthcare, job creation, so on and so forth. And digging around for a little bit of background information on this organisation, I found this. What began as a meeting between a man and a little girl has turned into an awareness campaign that involves one nail, polish, and a whole lot of men. The movement is called Polished Man, and it encourages men to paint one of their fingernails for a week to represent the 1 in 5 children who will be the victims of sexual violence in their lifetime. It all began when YGAP's Elliot Costello, an Australian, visited Cambodia for a project with Hanger International. There, he met a girl named Thea who had been abused. They painted their nails together, and he promised he'd always have one of his painted to remember her. That one promise has turned into a movement as more guys become a #PolishedMan to stand up against sexual violence against kids. According to its website, being a polished man means challenging violent behavior and language both locally and globally. With 96% of this violence perpetrated by men, the initiative is calling on them to be the voice of change by promoting positive male role models who support equality and child rights. We can create a community of male changemakers. So I followed the link on this 96% that they've got here, and that brought me to this document. Statistics about sexual violence from the National Sexual Violence Resource Centre. And one thing immediately jumped out at me about this, and that was the very first point. 1 in 5 women and 1 in 71 men will be raped at some point in their lives. Sure enough, their source for this piece of information was the CDC. Yes, that's the same CDC who I have on this channel demonstrated kind of has a very poor understanding of the definition of the term rape, because they completely exclude from their definition the concept of made to penetrate. That is, by the CDC's definition of rape, a woman can have sex with a man without his consent, or can force a man to perform oral sex on her without his consent, and she will not be committing the crime of rape. So we can see that this organisation isn't above using very, very questionable sources for its statistics. So sure enough, I decided to look at the point that they've made. As you can see here, 96% of people who sexually abuse children are male. I followed the citation to that, which brought me to this document, Child Sexual Abuse Prevention Overview, wherein we find a slightly different claim based on law enforcement reports. 96% of people who sexually abused a child were male, this time referencing Snyder 2000. Following that through brings us to this document, the Bureau of Justice Statistics, Sexual Assault on Young Children as Reported to Law Enforcement, Victim Incident and Offender Characteristics, an NIBRS statistical report, or for the sake of brevity, NIBRS. The data for this report comes from the years 1991 through to 1996 and is only looking at reports in 12 states. Because I would like to remind everyone, that is what NIBRS is. It is the reports of something happening. It's not tracking conviction rates, it's tracking the number of reports made. And in this instance, it's the number of reports across a 5-year period in only 12 states. And it's using the FBI's offense coding structure, which will put sexual offenses into 4 categories: rape, forcible sodomy, sexual assault with an object, and forcible fondling. And this got me wondering, how does the FBI, and therefore NIBRS, define things like rape and sexual assault? So I thought I'd look that up, and I found this. Beginning in 2013, the FBI UCR program defines rape for SRS UCR purposes as penetration, no matter how slight, of the vagina or anus with any body part or object, or oral penetration by a sex organ of another person without the consent of the victim. The new definition updated the 80-year-old historical definition of rape, which was carnal knowledge of a female forcibly and against her will. Effectively, the revision definition expands rape to include both male and female victims and offenders, and reflects the various forms of sexual penetration understood to be rape, especially non-consenting acts of sodomy and sexual assault with objects. And while they are correct that this does expand the definition to include male and female offenders, it doesn't fully include female offenders. Please note that, once again, this definition does not include the category of made to penetrate, otherwise known as forceful envelopment. But that doesn't really matter, since the information that we're looking at is coming from the early 90s, before this definition change was issued in 2013, meaning that they are still using the old definition, carnal knowledge of a female forcibly and against her will. So all of those young boys who were forced to have sex with women without their consent, all of those young boys who were forced to perform oral sex on a woman without their consent, basically any young boy who was forced to do anything to a woman without their consent is instantly discounted from this information in the early 90s. So I can guarantee you that that is going to have skewed this number. As a result of this incredibly narrow and manipulative definition of the concept of rape, it's then hardly surprising that when you look at some of the sexual assault figures here, you will find numbers in the 90-something% where it must have necessarily been perpetrated by a male. But one further extra little step of very mild dishonesty here, and this is a very mild gripe by comparison, is this. Females were more than 6 times as likely as males to be the victims of sexual assaults known to law enforcement agencies. We've already covered that their definitions are a little askew, and that will account for some of that discrepancy. More specifically, 86% of all victims of sexual assault were female. The relative proportion of female victims generally increased with age. 69% of the victims under 6 were female, compared to 73% of victims under 12, 82% of all juveniles under the age of 18 victims, and the female proportion of sexual assault victims reached 90% at the age of 13 and 95% at the age of 19. So in order to jump up to that 95-96%, they've included 19-year-olds. 19-year-olds are not children, they are adults. But as I said, by comparison to the problems of the definitions that they are using, and the other problem with the fact that they are going by reporting rates, not conviction rates, which lumps accusation in as well, this is probably the most minor of missteps. But I thought that it was one worth mentioning anyway. Heading back on over to the Polishedman website, I thought I'd try and get a little bit more information about them from the horse's mouth, as it were. So I downloaded one of the PDFs that they offer from the resources page of their website. You would have thought that this would be the page where they list all of their sources for all of the statistics that they quote, but they don't. It's just full of all of the typical slacktivist literature. So I pulled out this one regarding how you can do the Polishedman initiative in your workplace. And reading through this, I found something somewhat rather interesting, a slightly different take on the history of the Polishedman organization. YGAP CEO Elliot Costello came up with the idea for Polishedman after a visit to the project partner Hager International in Cambodia. One evening, he met a young girl named Thea. Due to their language barrier, the two played noughts and crosses and other games for hours. At the end of the night, Thea drew a heart on Elliot's palm and then painted all of his nails blue. The following day, Elliot heard about how Thea came to be in Hager's care. When she was 8, her father, the family's sole breadwinner, passed away, and Thea's mother sent her to an orphanage, hoping to give her safe refuge. Instead, Thea was physically and sexually assaulted on a daily basis for 2 years by the orphanage director. Elliot made the decision to paint one nail to remember Thea. When he later found out 1 in 5 children are affected by violence before the age of 18, the Polishedman movement was born. Now that adds a rather interesting dimension to the previous story, doesn't it? The reason that this child ended up in the care of a sexual predator at an orphanage was because the child's mother forced her to go there. Yes, a child with a parent went to an orphanage. Now, there's a few interesting possible reasons for this. The mother is jobless and has no means of paying for the child, although given the fact that women are allowed to work in Cambodia, that seems unusual unless the mother is incapable of working. There is then always the possibility that because Cambodia is quite a poor country, that she simply couldn't afford to keep the child. It's not unusual for poor families in poor countries to give up their children, on the off chance that the child will have a better life being cared for by someone with more money. And there's another reason that springs to mind which is considerably darker. In poor countries, it is not unheard of for poor families to sell their children. If the person who, I couldn't help but notice their gender is not listed here, if this person was a sexual predator running an orphanage, there is always the possibility that this person was basically buying children for the purpose of abusing them themselves or renting them out for others to abuse. The world is, after all, a terrible place, and child prostitution is something that happens. And by an odd coincidence, it's something that happens quite a bit in Cambodia as well. But that's all just a little bit of conjecture on my part based on very limited information. But I do just find it very interesting that the mother, who was not abusing the child, was then responsible for the child being in the position where they could be abused. And that's not being raised as a part of the problem here. But I'd like to address this new fact that's come up. In fact, they've got it on a page entitled The Facts. Globally, 1 in 5 children are affected by violence before the age of 18. And then next to that, they've got the 90% of all sexual violence against children is perpetrated by men. And then finally, 150 million girls and 73 million boys under 18 have experienced sexual violence. And this is where I have to cringe a little bit at the dishonesty of these numbers. We've already covered why the 90% of all sexual violence is a very misleading figure. But the fact that they have nestled that figure, which was taken from the early 90s from 12 states in the United States of America, and slipped it in between 2 global estimated figures, just makes it sound as if A, that 90% is completely accurate, which it isn't, but then it also makes it sound as if that is the situation globally, when it is not. So moving on to the 1 in 5 figure, this one seems to be a little bit more legit. It's a figure produced by the World Health Organization, specifically from the Global Status Report on Violence Prevention 2014. Unfortunately, this figure is given within a global context, and there is no specific breakdown, it seems, by country. And this 1 in 5 figure is unsurprisingly massively inflated by the inclusion of countries in places like the continent of Africa. However, the World Health Organization is once again another organization that somewhat downplays the victimization of boys, even with some of their own data, such as this from Figure 6, noting that when it came to Swaziland, they only surveyed girls. The World Health Organization does have a distinct pro-female leaning in regards to its research. To give you a quick example of how this bias affects their outcome, I'd like to introduce you to something called Bacha Bazi. It's an Afghani term. It literally translates to boy play from the words child and game. And Bacha Bazi are also locally known as the dancing boys. It is a practice in Afghanistan of young boys dressing as girls, dancing for men, and then being sexually abused by them. Owning such young male sex slaves is considered somewhat a status symbol amongst certain warlords in Afghanistan, and the practice is prevalent enough that there is even a colloquial saying about it. Women are for children, boys are for pleasure. Of course, referring to the reason why you would have sex with one or the other. And here is an example of it. That young boy with his tear-streamed mascara and eyeliner, from crying because he has been repeatedly forcefully sodomized against his will, because this is his way of earning money for himself and possibly for his family as well, assuming they haven't disowned him because of the shame. And this is a practice that only affects boys. What's the World Health Organization's take on this? Yeah, they don't acknowledge it. They have got absolutely no information about this practice. But the feminist concept of rape culture is very well represented. Anyway, let's wrap this up and consider how all of this fits together in the overall scheme of things such as child abuse. And given that the overall thrust of the argument from the beginning of this was the 90% caused by men, and that was based on figures from the USA, let's have a little look-see at where that fits into the overall data from there, shall we? Child Maltreatment 2014. This is the latest available publication of its kind from the US Department of Health and Human Services Administration for Children and Families. And we're going to go straight on down to the perpetrator demographics. We'll skip the part about age, since that's not really relevant. Let's look at the gender statistics, shall we? More than one half, 54.1% of perpetrators were women, and 44.8% of perpetrators were men. 1.1% were of unknown sex. So it would appear that child abuse is perpetrated more or less equally between men and women, but with a bit of a lean towards female perpetrators. But this is, of course, all child abuse, not just sexual violence. So let's quickly work out what percentage of child abuse sexual violence is, and we can do that by checking out the table Maltreatment Types of Victims. This gives you a state-by-state breakdown. But if we just go ahead and look at those national averages, shall we? And the overwhelming majority of children who suffer abuse at 75% are being neglected. After that, we have physical abuse at 17%, and coming in at third place is sexual abuse at 8.3%. Less than 10%. So as you can see, in order to get that 90% of men doing the sexual abuse thing, which they erroneously calculated earlier, they have had to ignore a staggering 90% of other child abuse. And that's how we make most of the victims disappear. But let's go a little bit deeper, shall we? Victims by relationship to their perpetrators. 91.6% by parents. But how does that break down? 40.7% mother only, compared to 20.5% for father only. Mother and father was 21.3%, and then following that up was mother with a non-parent, which is a new partner, 6.9%, and father with a non-partner, 1.1%, and then mother, father, and non-parent at only 1%. So if we add together all of those categories that include the mother, 69.9%. Basically, 70% of the time a child is being abused the mother is in some way responsible. And doing the same thing for the father, we come to 43.9. Basically, 44%. 70% of cases of child abuse, the mother is involved. 44% of cases of child abuse, the father is going to be involved. And this is from raw numbers of conviction. Tell me again about that 90% of men that came from reports alone. Although what I will say about this victims by relationship to perpetrator, men do have women beat, with some random relative that happens to be male being 3% and a male partner 2.6%, compared to the female equivalents of 1.7 and 0.3. And I'd like to point out that rather than coming from reports from 12 states in the early 90s, this has come from 47 states from 2014. And since this comes from the Child Abuse and Neglect Data System, it's based on times when things were found that were actually actionable, not just someone saying something happened. And for the eagle-eyed of you who have spotted that these numbers add up to over 100%, it's because this table is also taking into account repeat instances. And because of the way they count them, it will add up to over 100%. So, Polished Man, feeding you some very dishonest numbers taken from outdated or biased sources, which are then further twisted by the people sharing them until 90% of everything bad that happens to children is done by men, when in reality child abuse is really not actually that gendered. But if you did want to play the gender card on perpetrators, women do it more than men. But let's be honest, this entire campaign is nothing more than a bunch of slacktivist virtue signaling. People can share all of this misleading data while putting up selfies of themselves with one nail painted up on their social media pages so that they can feel like they're making a change in the world while doing absolutely nothing. Hell, their website even has a date-by-date guide telling you what you should be posting if you want to take part. As if to say, don't try and think about this too hard, because you can't have people questioning what it is that you're saying, right?